morning, everyone. How are you all doing? Okay, it doesn't sound like the conference has been very exciting. Because I said good morning and none of you barely responded. You're just like, hi. Or maybe it's because we're in this little corner where you can't see it. Good morning. Good morning. Is everybody awake? Are we all in the room? I'm just making sure because you're about to be part of one of the most important conversations that's taking place in South Africa right now, and you have to be awake for it. So, because this is an international conference, right? And I'm aware of the fact that there are lots of people who are in the room who are not South African. Maybe by show of hands, let's see everybody that's traveled far and wide to be here. Welcome to South Africa, everyone. It's great to have you in our country. Has it been good so far? Have you had an awesome time? Awesome. Do you know what Zupta is? Not yet. We'll get to it. So you've probably realized, being in South Africa for about at least 3 days now, that we've got our own way of saying things, of doing things. You know, the English language might bring with it a different experience for you. So there's some words that I think are important for you to know now that you're in South Africa. And I'll start with number 3. The word blesser. Have you heard of the word blesser? So a blesser is just because we're a giving country. We believe in sharing everything that we have. So we bless people. So that word is actually, officially, one of the top 3 words in South Africa. It's number 3. Number 2 is white monopoly capital. Do you know what white monopoly capital is? If you're unsure, go and ask the former Bell Pottinger, and I'm sure they will be able to tell you what white monopoly capital is. Or actually, they might not be talking on the subject anymore. It's a bit of a sensitive point. And the biggest word in South Africa for 2017, right? And this is actually research. I know it sounds like I'm kidding, but this is research that was done by the Pan-African National Board, and they actually look at the biggest words in South Africa. The biggest word for 2017 was state capture. Do we know what state capture is? Yes? No? Maybe? Okay. So the word state capture, welcome Thando. You may be seated. Yes. So state capture, the top word in South Africa for 2017, was used over 20,231 times. This is 11,000 South African newspapers. The word has received majority of coverage in newspapers, accounting for 68% of all articles that were written, and 19% of mentions in South African newspapers. And some of the people here are actually to blame for that. We'll start with blaming Adriaan Basson because he's one of the editors of the biggest publications in the country. So this conversation is going to be around why state capture has captured the imagination and even the conversation that's taking place in South Africa. On my panel this morning, help me welcome, ooh, my iPad is going crazy. Help me welcome a man who needs no introduction after the last couple of weeks. He's had a turbulent, no, you've had a great time, Jacques. It hasn't been turbulent. Jacques has had a turbulent couple of weeks following the release of the book. Jacques, have you called your people? The mic is giving us problems. Are you to blame for this? Jacques has had a turbulent couple of weeks following the launch and the release of his book, The President's Keeper, but he's a well-known journalist and filmmaker. Please help me welcome him. Round of applause. Adriaan Basson is the editor of News 24. It's one of the biggest publications in South Africa. And he's also been busy this week publishing and launching his book, Enemy of the People. And it's also a book on the president and state capture. Please help me welcome him. Susan Comrie, who's also, along with Adriaan Basson, freshly award-winning last night at the Vodacom Journalist of the Year Awards for the work that they've been doing in uncovering and really getting to the bottom of the Gupta leaks. If you don't know about them yet, you will know by the end of this session. Welcome, Susan. And of course, she's an investigative journalist with AmaBhungane. And last but not least, equally decorated, senior investigative journalist who tried to do broadcasting for what? All of 2 minutes, Thanduxolo. Thanduxolo Jika. So perhaps just to make sure that we are all in the room, and I know, Susan, this is something that you feel quite strongly about, and of course we'll take anybody on the floor to answer some of the questions. Let's begin with state capture, the concept, the idea, where it stems from. What is it? What does it involve and include? We know it involves corruption and bribery, but it's not really that. So what are we talking about here when we reference state capture?
Hi. Yeah, I think it's a, look, it's a concept that if the word isn't familiar to most of you, the concept of what it is no doubt familiar to a lot of you in the countries that you work in. I mean, technically what we're talking about is a more sort of a systematic form of corruption that isn't just, one-to-one bribery. It's not, I give you a bribe, you give me a contract. It's really a far more complex system where the huge chunks of the state have kind of become involved in looking after the interests of particular groups. I mean, our research is sort of focused largely on one particular group, the Gupta family, but I mean, I think as Jacques will kind of touch on, there's by no means one group that has single-handedly captured the whole state. There's a number of groupings who are sort of working to extract value from the state. And I mean, I think what we're also talking about is, we're not just saying this is people who are in positions of power who are corrupted in order to, give contracts or that kind of thing to various companies. We're potentially talking about people being placed into those positions in the first place in order to carry out the sort of mandate from, the groups, the companies, the individuals who have captured them. And I mean, I think where that becomes really damaging is that the state starts to sort of collapse quite quickly when the people who are in those positions were never placed in those positions in the first place because they were particularly qualified for that or because they had the interests of the state and the citizens at heart. We're talking about people who seem to, from what we can tell, spend large chunks of their day seeing how they can extract value from the state for private individuals. And sometimes that means not just corruptly giving a contract to a particular company, but creating a contract that there was no need for in the first place in order to make sure that huge chunks of state funds get channeled out and given to private individuals.
How different is it from the general corruption that we see that takes place with other governments in other countries? What makes it so unique and peculiar? Adriaan?
Thanks, Cathy. Look, I think, for many years as an investigative journalist, I've grappled with this issue because we often get accused, specifically in this country, but I'm sure in many countries, of people get fatigued, of all the scandals and the exposés. And we were pushed to really connect the dots better from the corrupt mayor who got a Mercedes-Benz to actually the people who suffered because of him getting his Mercedes-Benz to ultimately the company that had to fire their employees because they didn't get that tender because they were trying to do things fairly. And for me, state capture helped us really to connect those dots much better. Sam Soul taught me early in my career that the arena that we should be looking at is where business, crime, and politics connect, that nexus, that triangle. And I think that is correct. I think that's at the heart of state capture. If you can show in our example, in our case, how literally President Jacob Zuma, being the president of the country, has led to certain companies getting tenders from Transnet and certain monies being funneled to the Guptas through Dubai. Because of ministers he's appointed, that minister appoints the board chairperson, that board chairperson appoints a CEO, who appoints a CFO, etc., etc. I think also what our investigation taught me this year is that state capture is far from that one-on-one type of tender corruption that Susan spoke about. It is literally when policy starts to be influenced in countries, and when the fiscus, the spending of the fiscus, the budgetary process starts getting skewed towards certain projects and certain policies to favor certain groupings. Another example from our country is nuclear. We know that it's unaffordable, and people in Treasury who opposed this for many years are now being moved physically out of Treasury. That's not a tender. We're not even close to the tender process. We're still at policy regulation area. So for me, it just shows that rot at that heart of that nexus that kind of controls the state.
Maybe perhaps before we get to where we are now, to also accommodate the full audience that we have in the room today, let's talk about the point of being able to connect the dots. What were some of the key information that started emerging that actually pointed and painted a picture of this is what is happening in the country? Thanduxolo.
Oh, thank you. Connecting the dots. Well, I mean, it's a combination of events that started taking place in the country. I think one of the turning points, I mean, because at some point we were writing, but not really connecting the individuals. But the turning point, I think, was the firing of Mohlahlana. Because it all now became blatant.
Mohlahlana, who of course was the former finance minister.
And there was never really any explanation as to why was Mohlahlana being fired. But we were writing stories here and there about the nuclear deal that he was opposing, the issue with SAA. But then we started getting to know that there were certain individuals the Guptas were close to, certain people that they were preferring to be in certain positions, because by this time they had already captured each and every other department in government and state-owned entities. But they actually needed treasury more than any other department so that they can be able to really capture the state, and now you are able to influence. So from there onwards, I mean, we got trips to Dubai by Minister Des van Rooyen, who was the 4 days finance minister at the time. And he could not explain why he had gone to Dubai for 1 day. Mosebenzi Zwane had also done that, minerals resources minister. From there was also now a set of documents started flowing through, fast. People were now trying to actually say to us as journalists, I mean, I know AmaBhungane were getting different stories, Sunday Times was getting different stories, News 24, they were getting different stories. So it was a set of events that took place, and I think it was the recklessness of President Jacob Zuma. Thank God actually he became reckless that we managed to connect the dots bit by bit.
From the outside looking in, the story of state capture can often just be one big messy web, right? But at the end of the day, it comes down to individuals. What Minister A did in order to secure a contract for Company B. And you've been looking at the individuals, the people, and trying to get to the bottom of these links, and perhaps just give us very simple case studies that I think make it more tangible, because right now state capture still it feels like something that's out there. How do we make it something palpable?
Yeah, let me just say that in my book I don't mention the name state capture more than 2 or 3 times. What I try to do in the book is rather to explain how could state capture happen. And state capture could happen, among others, or primarily because Jacob Zuma had destroyed the law enforcement agencies. There's nothing left of the Hawks, crime intelligence, SARS, state security, the NPA, name them. And that's why, I mean, if you look at the Gupta emails, for example, I spoke to someone while I was writing this book who said what is peculiar about the Gupta emails, and Adriaan can maybe sort of like comment on that, is that they didn't really try to hide what they were doing. It was quite blatant. There they are, the emails. Because they knew that it was safe to do it. There was not going to be any consequences. And if you think that since the firing of Finance Minister Nene, I think it was December 2015, there's been a body of evidence about fraud and corruption and state capture, if you want to call it that. And it's not just my book, it's Adriaan's book, and there's other books, Ronnie Casserol's, and there's been all the Gupta emails, yet absolutely nothing has happened. There's been no consequences. If you think about somebody like Popo Molefe, who was the chairperson of PRASA, who had to beg the Hawks to investigate, I think, 19 billion rand of corruption. They had done nothing. Absolutely nothing had happened. I mean, the organized crime unit of the Hawks are investigating me. They're not investigating Sifiso Buthelezi for his shenanigans at PRASA. And that's the problem we're sitting with at the moment, is there's absolutely no consequences for these people.
I want to talk about facts and figures in a moment, but the systematic breakdown of democratic institutions that are supposed to hold leaders to account. Because ultimately, when we look at the impact of state capture, that's where the erosion has taken place. So what does that systematic breakdown of institutions look like? And if there is a government that is trying to capture a state, which institutions do they go for?
I think, you know, Jacques has actually mentioned them. So you need, in state capture, you know, as we've learned now, you need enablers. You know, those are the politicians. They would be your enablers. They would be the people, they would be officials somewhere, in board members. Those would be your enablers. You also need the protectors. The protectors would be the people in the law enforcement agencies. They will not be acting against anybody. Those enablers, we can sort of mention them. We had head of Hawks, Benning Clemeze. Hawks have never arrested anybody that has been accused of any corruption in the state capture. You've got the National Prosecuting Authority. You ensure those institutions don't work. On top of that, you need SARS, the revenue services. You know, they turn a blind eye to each and every transgression that has been, you know, committed. Billions have been taken out of the country inexplicably, and they've been taken out by the Guptas. So the systematic thing, so you have politicians on one side, and then you ensure that the law enforcement agencies are in absolute disarray. Nobody's going to be arrested. Nobody's going to be prosecuted. The only time that you actually try and prosecute people is the ones that are doing the right thing, Pravin Gordhan, Jacques, Pauw, and many others. So it's a complex system like that, but all that is, you just need chaos. That's why we have not had a permanent Hawks head. That's why we've not had a permanent National Director of Public Prosecutions, except that this one who's there seems to have some skeletons. That's why they're keeping him there. The previous one seemed to have been playing along until a certain point where he touched the wrong nerve. So once your governance is absolutely not working, there's no accountability, and you know for a fact that nobody's going to go to court, nobody is going to challenge you. You actually have a way that you just continue doing what you do. Like what Jacques was saying, what we saw in those emails was actually shocking. Guptas were giving instructions to senior government officials. You know, people who tried to do the right thing in government were kicked out of positions. You know, we've got a famous case of Themba Maseko, was the head of government communications. He says he got a direct call from the president who said, go and meet the Guptas, they need your help. You know, and nothing has actually happened. And And I think throughout all this reporting that we've done, all of us, we've at least proven in terms of the corrupt, in terms of PRECA, Prevention and Corruption and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act, that at least there's a case of money laundering, racketeering, corruption against the Guptas and their associates, but nobody is actually doing anything about it. So that's how it actually works. As long as your law enforcement agencies are dead, nothing will happen.
I just want to quickly add to Jika's points. In our book, we quote a former constitutional court, Van Kriegler, who has actually also established a civil society institution called Freedom Under Law in South Africa that litigates. And his quotation is very poignant for me, and it kind of opened my mind. He said, what the public doesn't realize is that a captured prosecutor is much more dangerous than a captured judge. And if you think about it, a judge cannot bring cases to court. Ultimately, if cases don't come to court, there's no judge who can even, sway the case a certain way. So I think the breakdown of the prosecuting authority, and Jika, it looked to me almost like Zuma had a very specific strategy of appointing tainted people into critical positions in the police. If you think of Beki Cele and people after him in the prosecuting authority, on Kloba Jiba, there's always some dirt on them. When Kolisi Nkasana came into the NPA, almost a few weeks later, crime intelligence started digging into his past and found some case where he stabbed someone when he was young, a teenager. It's like there was this, and I'm sure this is not unique to South Africa. I'm sure this is an international phenomenon where the opponents or the politicians start to find dirt on the prosecutors, the policemen, the intelligence agents, etc. What I find fascinating in our country is that there's still this veneer of people pretending that we are fighting corruption. Just last week we had an anti-corruption summit where government was showing their successes, And the only thing they had there to show, which they spoke about at length for 3 hours, was the John Block case. And, obviously poor John Block was the one, almost said fucker, who kind of, at the end of the day, the ANC could cut loose. Jacob Zuma could cut loose to say, look, we have to have at least one case to show for our tenure. But there's like hundreds of other cases which just completely go nowhere. And the way to do it, to come back to Jacques' point, is physically, you don't kick the case away. That's why I don't think Harry now will be successful with the private prosecution. You just put one investigator on the entire PROSA and let him sit on that case for 10 years until people forget.
But it's also been a long time in the making, Jacques. It's not something that they woke up and said, oh, this morning, 2015, this is our plan. When you look at the paper trail, it's a well-executed plan that was set in motion almost a decade ago.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, since Jacob Zuma assumed power in May 2009, we had an erosion of the law enforcement agencies. And as soon as there was a credible person that showed a sign of independence, somebody like Anwar Ramat, who was the head of the Hawks, they very quickly got rid of him. They planted dirt on him. They got a newspaper to publish it. They suspended him, and they virtually drove him out. If you think about SARS, in my book, for example, I distinguish between two SARS regimes, before 94 and then from the end of 94. When Jacob Zuma appointed the SARS commission at the end of 2014, he appointed Tom Mohlahlana, whose highest position in government was prisons boss. Tom Mohlahlana knows nothing about tax. Tom Mohlahlana went to SARS to get rid of excellent, skilled, and dedicated civil servants that posed a threat to Jacob Zuma, his friends, and his cronies. Because before Mohlahlana assumed power, SARS was investigating Jacob Zuma, they were investigating his son, they were investigating his cronies, they were investigating the Guptas. So they had to get rid of these SARS officials. They posed a terrible threat to Jacob Zuma. The result of this is that SARS, for example, doesn't have an investigative capacity anymore, because there were 5 investigations units, they've all been disbanded. It must be the only modern tax collector in the world that doesn't have an investigative capacity, which means we can't go after organized crime anymore. We can't go after organized criminals anymore, which has led to a deficit. a 50 billion rand deficit in the a 30 billion rand deficit in the previous tax year, and probably a 50 billion rand deficit in this year, which poses a terrible threat to the country. This is the money that's supposed to pay social grants, for example. This is the money that's supposed to pay for hospitals and schools. And there is a huge potential for civil unrest, civil disobedience, if we can't do that anymore. And now the president wants to enter into a R1 trillion nuclear deal. I have no doubt that Jacob Zuma doesn't understand noughts. Because, I mean, the other day I had to go and look on Google, how do you write a trillion, which is 1 and 12 noughts. I don't think Jacob Zuma can do Google, so he's not going to know how to write a trillion. But that, and now in the previous tax year, SARS collected 1.25 trillion rand. That is the kind of money that Zuma wants to spend on a nuclear deal. And once again, if civil society is not going to stop the nuclear deal, it will probably go through, and the consequences can be dire.
Susan, up until the leaks, the Gupta leaks that we had, much of the conversation around state capture was serious, but the Gupta leaks took it to another level, because for the first time we have details of people, of when, of where, of how, just connecting the dots even further, and I think providing that substance to some of the allegations that had already existed. What was that trunk of emails like for a journalist like yourself, who at AmaBhungane you've been working 24/7, going through how many?
Conservatively 200,000 emails and documents, but it's a lot more. It's way over that. Yeah, I mean, look, it's been a fascinating process for us. You know, obviously the first thing that everyone did is they opened the trove and they typed in Zuma, and then the next thing they did is they typed in nuclear. A lot of the stories have been a lot more complex to find. I mean, there's been incredible stuff that's come out of it. And for us as journalists, it's been an amazing, you know, Ferial was talking in the opening remarks yesterday about it being a masterclass. And it really is, because, you know, for journalists, we are going through tons of different deals. We're seeing how they structured things, how corruption worked, how kickbacks were paid. So we're learning very, very fast how to identify lots of different techniques and that kind of thing. So it's been great from that perspective. I mean, it's also been really, you know, for a lot of us, we've been reporting on the Guptas for years, and when they used to speak to us, they don't anymore, they would say, you've got this completely wrong, you know, you're lying about that. We would get trashed not just by them, but by Eskom, by Transnet, that kind of thing. And it's like you get to see this stuff now, and you're like, oh, we were right. They were completely lying to us about this. You know, the Estina dairy farm is a very good example. I mean, before I joined AmaBhungane, my colleagues had kind of gone in and rooted out this small dairy project in the Free State, and it was a project that was meant to benefit small local farmers who really needed intervention from the state. And the Guptas for years flat out denied that they had anything to do with it. Once we got the leaks, we could not only see that they were lying about that they had their hands all over the deal, but that they were actually taking money from that deal, laundering it through various shell companies in Dubai, bringing it back and using it to pay for a very lavish wedding. So I mean, for us, it's proved a lot of the things that we suspected, but it's certainly been eye-opening in that we had no idea just how bad it was.
The fact-checking process has been a crucial one, because a lot of the stories that are published are not only rejected by those who are the main, by those who the main culprits in the stories. We have ministers that hold press conferences to refute what has been written. So how do you deal with the challenge of having to fact-proof your story to ensure that it's solid, and yet at the same time knowing that, you know, how to ensure the credibility of your sources?
Well, I'll hand it over to both of you just now. I'll just quickly jump in there to say, I mean, look, although the leaks it's a massive, amazing trove of information, it's by no means the only documents that we're relying on. I mean, all of us who've worked on the Guptas and you know, their deals for years, we have an incredible trove of sources, of documents and that kind of thing. So a lot of the time it is piecing together what's in there and then also with outside sources, you know.
Well, when it comes to, you know, sourcing, it's one of my worst fears to be wrong. You know, I used to work with Jacques at Media 24 Investigations, he knows. But I think, like Susan says, many of us actually had, you know, bits and pieces of this information. One example, you know, I knew a while back when we wrote about Mosebenzi Zwane going to Switzerland at the same time as the Guptas went there. I knew he was actually in the room with the Guptas to organize the Glencore deal. But I could only place him in Zurich, you know, not at the hotel, really with the Guptas. But we went further because you don't only just, you know, rely on one set of you know, documents, one person to tell you that this is what happened. You go through a number of people to, you know, to confirm. There's a number of people who are very unhappy. Of course, there's people who lost deals because of, you know, the Guptas. There's a lot of government officials who lost their jobs because of the Guptas. Others are simply just disgusted. So we go through very rigorous checks when we do our stories. We try and satisfy ourselves. Are we accurate? Is it fair? You know, are we getting at least different people? I mean, when we wrote about Mcebisi Jonas, that the Guptas had offered him a job, we had the worst Sunday that Sunday because the ANC...
You're leaving the best part of the story out. Some people in the room may not know.
All right, sorry. So our deputy finance minister, when Nhlanhla Nene was about to be fired, it was Mcebisi Jonas, and the Guptas apparently called him and they offered him a job. And of course, the president's son was there, Duduzane Zuma. Is a very famous character who's always there wherever the Guptas are. So clearly, I mean, if you connect the dots, he is a proxy for somebody. You can guess who that person is. But anyway, we had to go through, you know, a lengthy process of trying to figure out if this thing indeed really happened. We needed to know exactly where the meeting took place, when, who took who, where. Because it was a rumor. It was, I think most journalists knew that this thing was out there. You know, it was a rumor since December. But, you know, we had to be absolutely 100% sure that we are at least accurate about the offer. When we managed to find where the house, where the meeting took place, etc., and you know who took who where, we satisfied ourselves that actually we are on point. We put the story out. But on that Sunday, I'm coming to the point that ANC people, government people will deny. That Sunday we were insulted left, right, and center. You know, I remember Zizi Kodwa. Zizi Kodwa is ANC spokesperson. He said, we write gossip masquerading as news. You know, it was a horrible Sunday because our phones were ringing the whole bloody day. You know, I had to switch off my phone. I couldn't play with my kids because the bloody phone was going off the whole time. But only on Tuesday, you know, the Mcebisi Jonas came forward and said, yes, this thing happened. So in the process of trying...
And he was offered...
And he was offered, how much was it? 600 million. Yeah, and there was 60 in cash that he was going to get. I mean, it's blatant. It's blatant corruption that they were, you know, trying to do. But we do take quite a lot of, you know, precautions when it comes to stories. And I believe, you know, most of us investigative reporters, you know, Adriaan, Basson, AmaBhungane, we've been quite thorough in the past few years to try and actually eliminate being misled in terms of stories and not rely only on what one document you get, because we've been burnt before in this country. You know, there's fake intelligence reports that even the president relies on to fire ministers. So you have to be quite careful, you know, with what you do.
Cathy, if you will allow me to maybe introduce a slightly uncomfortable topic, which I think is necessary to discuss. Look, I think when we talk about fact-checking, in fact, we must also talk about fake news. And fake news doesn't only mean false news, as we used to define it previously, but also planted stories, and specifically when publications that are very prominent in the country gets it wrong. So I'm very glad to see what's going on at the Sunday Times and that they fixed their systems and that they're producing great journalism. But for a few weeks, and Jacques details this in his book as well, the Sunday Times actively contributed to this perception, this false perception that there's a rogue unit in SARS, which in my view tremendously contributed to the shutting down of that capacity in SARS. Reported that SARS was, for example, running a brothel, which just simply didn't exist. Reported that SARS was spying on President Jacob Zuma when the people who were allegedly spied on him weren't even working for SARS at the time. And this is not a unique again to South Africa. It's a massive danger to all of us in the room. I'm sure all of us has been leaked documentation to misinform us, to kind of derail a narrative. I'm sure it's happening today with all of us. And I think as an industry in South Africa, we've learned hard lessons as individual journalists that no one is above being misled, being captured almost as part of a certain narrative. So yeah, I thought I'd just put it out there to maybe wake up everyone a bit.
Sure.
When I left journalism at the end of 2014, I think South African journalism was at its absolute lowest. That's when the Sunday Times started pushing the SARS rogue unit stories. And Tom Mohlahlana is on record where he said, I cannot allow this reporting to go on without taking any action. And he then suspended the top executive of SARS, and from there they were driven out. And journalism was at a really, really low point. And it was one of the reasons why I left journalism. But I do think, if you look at the three people next to me, I think journalism has recovered magnificently. If you look at the Gupta emails. And I think, I've always said that, there's only three things that stand between us and a gangster state. And the one is the courts, the second is civil society, and the third is the media. And I think the media is doing a magnificent job at the moment.
It's an election year, and of course a lot of the stories that are being published now have a lot of implications going into the ANC's elective conference in December. So how then do we ensure, Adriaan, that this factionalism, this plotting and this plotting of stories does not happen in the way that it did in previous years? And ultimately really defining what a presidency could potentially be and look like.
You have to be super critical. Every time you get leaked documents, all these SMSs, WhatsApps doing the rounds now with numbers of our branches apparently are going to vote, And what I've just said to my reporters, you simply have to check with the branches. We cannot use any of this information before you've spoken to them. Of course, the ANC's complete non-transparent, culture in terms of elections doesn't help. Because there's no, besides the numbers of delegates going to conference, there's no other way to establish actually transparently how they are going to vote. Cathy, it's the old journalistic principles. It hasn't changed. Just because we're digital now doesn't mean the rules have gone. Check your sources. Your source is the first one you investigate. Double check, triple check everything. Speak to everyone, get comment. Make sure you speak to the other side, verify information. Don't just publish what one person tells you or what one document states. There's massive money up for grabs with this ANC conference. The loser, whoever it will be, whether it's Cyril or Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, that camp will lose massively financially. So there's massive money being thrown around at this stage to win the PR battle as well. And the introduction of fake news. Cyril has been, Ramaphosa, our deputy president, has been linked to the so-called white monopoly capital on social media, and every day there's tons of these images being pumped out with his face on it. And that influences the debate as well. So yeah, it's just sticking to those basic journalistic principles. That hasn't changed.
But the rot, I suppose, which has also been highlighted by the coverage, is that it doesn't just exist in the public sector. The private sector has been complicit, really, in allowing the situation to be what it is. And we can talk about Bell Pottinger, McKinsey, KPMG, SAP. Let's talk about the role then of multinationals who have allowed the situation to carry on underground as if everything was above board, legitimizing reports that were never supposed to be legitimized.
You know, I think we've got too much faith in the private sector. It's just that, you know, when we reported, I remember reading one of the first stories by AmaBhungane relating to Trillian and them, and McKinsey, and we did some follow-ups. Well, international companies, and any company, they're driven by profit. They don't care how much it comes, how it comes to them, how it gets there, as long as they make profit. It now makes sense. Why would KPMG or any other audit firm have adverse findings against people that are paying them? If I'm gonna give you 20 million rand to do an audit on me, would you find anything wrong in what I'm doing? So for me, I think they've always been part of those enablers as long as they were making money. I mean, the McKinsey story with Trillian, they knew what was going on. I mean, they knew that Trillian was not a black-owned company. Eric Wood is not black, he's a white guy. They were dealing with him all the time, but they said they were partnering with a BEE partner. They were happy to take $1 million and give away just 20 million. They were fine with it. And if you think about it globally, multinationals have always acted in their own best interest, which is profit, and never anything else.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to add to that, I mean, that's one of the really shocking things for us that's come out of that, is the role of these huge multinational companies. McKinsey, SAP, Leaper, Software AG, China South Rail. I mean, these companies have been willing to, we've kind of called them, we've referred to them as sort of icebreakers. Because, a company like Trillian, which was as Jika has explained, it was a small kind of consulting firm. It had literally just been set up that month. As connected as they are, they can't walk into Eskom and get a deal that's potentially going to be worth 9.4 billion rand. But a company like McKinsey can. And, McKinsey, there were all the signs for them that they were engaging in a really problematic relationship, but they were willing to do it. And effectively, those companies have kind of gone first. They've opened the door for those giant contracts at some of our big state-owned companies. And it's allowed sort of smaller, front companies and that kind of thing to sort of come in behind them. And that's where the really damaging, huge amounts of money are being taken out.
I don't think that these companies are not just complicit in state capture, but they're complicit in fraud in many cases. And if we had the law enforcement agencies we should have, a company like executives at KPMG, for example, could have been charged with fraud. Because in the KPMG case, as far as SARS is concerned, for example, and they were paid 22 million rand for their report, is that at one point the SARS firm of attorneys send a memo to KPMG, and they say to KPMG, this is what we want you to find in your report. Now, unfortunately for them, that draft that they sent to KPMG was full of grammatical errors. And KPMG copied and pasted their recommendations or their email. They copied as is with all the grammatical errors. They didn't even proofread their bloody report. And they copied and pasted exactly like that. That's fraud. Has to be. But we don't have anybody to investigate this.
Just maybe a final point on the private sector. I think we should also stop in South Africa have this discussion of private sector corruption versus public corruption, because it's all one bloody thing. And if it's one thing that the Gupta leaks has taught us, is for every corrupt Transnet deal, there's a private company and probably consultancy and probably audit firm involved, and lawyers probably. So, I mean, it's one thing, guys. It's not different stuff, and you should investigate the entire transaction. That's maybe where we're not that good. Is, if you investigate a tender or a deal or a consultancy agreement, make sure to look from the bloody minister or the president to the CEO of the SOE, to the CEOs of that company, to the auditors.
All right. I'm going to leave the last part of our conversation for later on, but for now, I think it's a good point to bring in the audience to take some questions that you may have for our panelists. We do have a roving mic that is going on either side of the aisle. Adriaan, I think I'm going to borrow that mic, and just perhaps say who you're directing your question to, and they'll take the question. Let me work my way up.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Ntokozo. I'm from eNCA. What I've personally noticed around the discussion of state capture and white monopoly capital, as Cathy mentioned at the beginning of the talk, that they are the most searched terms in the country, and that's what we do online. And somehow these discussions end up being very intellectual in terms of the language, in terms of, for example, we're having this discussion in English. When people are interviewed in studio, they're interviewed in English, and it's just very out of reach for the old lady in Soweto who is going to be voting in the upcoming elections. So how do we then break down this conversation so that the man on the street is able to understand what white monopoly capital is and form an opinion around that, or what state capture is? Because you have politicians who even quote these terms, and when you go in depth, they themselves don't even understand what they mean. So a lot of the discussion around what we're talking about here has been in English, and the people that really need to be moved by this information are speaking vernacular languages. So how do we bring it down to the level of the poor people, the illiterate people, so that they understand when we say the presidency is corrupt, this is why we are saying they're corrupt, and this is the evidence that we have, to show that they are corrupt.
It's such a difficult one, nobody wants to answer it.
No, I think you're right. I mean, it's a huge failing on our part that these discussions are largely taking place in English. And it's really something that we have to do better at. I think also, it's something that we perhaps forget sometimes as journalists, that, just proving a clever way that money laundering happened isn't enough. It might be super interesting for us, but unless you're saying to someone, look, the reason that you should care that there was a massive bribe paid in Hong Kong on this train, on the locomotive deal at Transnet, then that was laundered back, is because, Transnet's now paying for those trains. They're having to cut staff. They're having to cut one of the recommendations that we saw from internal documents about how to save money. They said, let's cut bursaries, all bursaries that we're doing. So let's cut 20 million rand in that. So I think we really need to do a better job in terms of not just saying, 5.3 billion rand could have bought the X many RDP houses, but saying this is actually the consequence that we can trace through. When the Transnet pension fund, for instance, when they sign, give away these massive deals for doing interest rate swaps to kind of Gupta-linked firms and that kind of thing, that's money that's being taken out of the pension fund. That's railway workers who are already in a pretty dire position, who are losing out. So I think we need to do a better job of that, because I think we have been a little bit too focused on the forensic detail and on the detail that perhaps sort of interests us as journalists, but perhaps isn't really hitting the mark with the average person in South Africa.
Just to quickly add, I think we have, just to support us a bit, I do think we are a bit better than we were a few years ago, because our weakness is really that writing, because it's so much facts and stuff you need to get in. And I think one of the reasons Jacques' books is so successful is because of his brilliant writing style. He really writes colorful, and he describes his characters in a way that we sometimes don't think we have to. It's just about the facts and the figures. So that's the one thing. The second thing is, just from a writing point of view, most of us were working for newspapers a few years ago, but we now have video to enrich our publication. So, for example, recently my colleagues went to Dubai to see where these Gupta shell companies are. They came back, and the prime piece of content they delivered was actually a video, not a written piece. We also wrote about it, but we produced a video. And just lastly, I do think there's a lot being done in terms of the Daily Sun in South Africa, writes a lot about the Guptas and President Zuma now. I have long discussions with the editor, Reggie, who says to me, you know, you could have seen the tide turning as these stories were coming out. On Izindaba 24, our own isiZulu publication, we cooperated with AmaBhungane recently in publishing a full investigation into KZN security contracts in isiZulu, as well as some of the Gupta Leaks articles. So I do think we're getting there, not as quick as we need to, but yeah, there are some improvements.
Can I go? Firstly, congratulations to Jacques, to the greatest comeback since the resurrection of Jesus Christ, I think. Congratulations to you all for doing a fantastic job. South Africa, investigative journalism is certainly at the cutting edge, globally. What I've not, and I've been following all of your work very, very closely from Windhoek, where I kind of plug away in my own little furrow. But what always seems obvious to me but never mentioned is that these guys, like the Guptas, always seem to find their way into the president's back pocket by the security services. And this is something that sort of, it's out there, but it's not really stated. There's something I saw, for example, in my experience with old Vita Palazzolo. He had Mugabe's, personal intelligence chief and security chiefs, on speed dial, Yoma's, everybody's basically. Has there any research in this regard, any work in this regard, showing how they use state intelligence? Because the thing about state intelligence is it's all like black box stuff. We don't know where they're going with the money. We know, Arthur Fraser has been doing strange things. But is there any evidence of direct connections, for example, between Fraser and the Guptas?
The problem with, for example, this state security agency is you are not even allowed to know how many people work there. You're not allowed to know what their budget is. I can tell you, but you're going to be in trouble if I tell you. Their operational budget, for example, is not audited by the Auditor General. He has no insight into how they spend their money. It's a big black hole in which money disappears. And we saw it, for example, with the example in my book, where one project ran by Fraser consumed R1 billion of taxpayers' money. And nobody's quite sure what happened to that money. Crime Intelligence has a secret fund at the moment of about 600 million rand. Now, we all know that Crime Intelligence is completely paralyzed. There's absolutely nothing going on. They haven't had a proper leader since 2011. They still have a commander, Richard Mdluli, but he's been on suspension since 2011, although he earns his salary every month and he got a bonus last year. But anyway, there's money, there's the secret fund. We don't know where that money is going to. And it's very, very difficult to find out. There is evidence, and I know it is being investigated by IPID, the Police Investigative Directorate, about rogue units, and they're situated somewhere between the Hawks and Crime Intelligence. The name of somebody like Ntlemeza is being mentioned, the previous head of the Hawks. I know that IPID, for example, visited the Sheraton Hotel in Pretoria because they occupied rooms in the Sheraton for a while. And these people have unlimited funds. They roam around. They only report to a few individuals. And then you start thinking about the break-ins into the offices of the Chief Justice, the NPA, political assassinations in KwaZulu-Natal. And I think you have to sort of connect the dots. But it's certainly something that needs investigation. There's certainly money available in the state. Money that they don't have to account for, which is the big thing in these secret funds. And where is that money going? It's very, very difficult to determine.
Hello, Eva Jung, a journalist with Danish newspaper Berlingske and a board member of GIJN. Thanks for a great session. So following this case from the other side of the world, I've had difficulty figuring out who had which leak. And so I'd like to know a little bit just a little bit more about what material you guys have been working on. For instance, conservatively put 200,000 emails. Was that later shared with other journalists, or what material did all of you work on?
I think we're all probably working on the same trove of information now. Yeah, I mean, so there's sort of two sets of leaks. The main set of leaks is what we call the Gupta leaks, or the Gupta emails. And I mean, I think, you know, our group, Jika's group, Adriaan's team, all of them are largely working on the same set of documents. Then there's sort of smaller leaks that have come out. So there's been like a leak from a former chief executive of Trillion. She was a head of one of the divisions of Trillion. And then that's sort of helped to inform all of the stories around McKinsey. So that's actually come out of a separate sort of leak of information. But yeah, I mean, the main leak that we are all working on, and I mean, it did come out slowly in the sense that, you know, there was initially, I mean, we initially had access to the full leak. I think you guys initially had access to a smaller, you know, amount of information, but then very quickly got access to the full amount of information. And there's also, you know, sort of technical issues in making all of that information available. So it has been a process, but now, I mean, the trove which we've now just made available last week to all journalists in the world is the main Gupta Leaks trove, which is several hundred thousands of emails and documents.
In science journalism, we have something called research translation, which some journalists do. They typically take complex science and sort of translate that to another audience. And I think that's why it was important for the Zuma crew that the SABC was captured, because the public broadcaster would have been an incredibly important way. So I think we have some of the SABC 8 here in the crowd today, and they actually, this is a very important part of this leg of ensuring that, you know, just another comment really, in speaking to other journalists from other parts of Africa, they're always surprised at how much media freedom we have, at the kind of things that Jacques can write. They can't, but maybe, maybe they can't because they can prosecute in those countries. But here we can write, but no prosecution can be done. So that missing leg is really kind of so that civil society, or actually just the level below even, people know about what it is that you're exposing. But yeah, excellent work. So it wasn't a question.
Okay, so my name is Glenda Daniels, and I'm from Wits University. So now, the way I see it, I'm sure you would agree, it happened at the point when the Scorpions were disbanded. That's nearly 10 years ago. So I'd like to ask the investigative journalists, do you think that the sudden awareness, because I mean, you guys have been doing the work for 10 years on the same issue, do you think the Gupta leaks were the impetus for a sudden new awareness that something terrible and systematic has happened for the last 10 years? Then I'd like to know if you think this would, I mean, it's the same question that everyone's been asking, do you think this would translate into anything at all at the December conference? Because I'm feeling optimistic that this is all out in the open, but am I misguided to feel this optimism? If you get my point, the law enforcement agencies are kaput. So why am I feeling like something is about to happen?
If I can respond to your second question first, Linda, I also get that feeling, and maybe you and I are just born optimists, which I like. I think you have to have a bit of that to survive as a journalist. But look, no, I think there is something happening. In our book, we speak about the fight back from civil society. There's this plethora of civil society institutions outside of media. Media is obvious. And you know, I can proudly say that our company, as one example, has invested heavily in original investigative reporting over the past 2 years. But just in civil society, you've seen Corruption Watch, you've seen Freedom Under Law, OUTA now employs about 60 people who do investigations. That's much more than my newsroom, and I guess most of us. So, you know, there is this new spirit, this new civil activism, which is fantastic. Whether it will lead to something in December, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if the ANC has received the memo. What was your first point? Oh, on the Scorpions. Look, I think the Gupta leaks, for me personally, opened up what we thought was happening and gave us that proof to finally, I mean, there's like thousands of leads. I mean, if we were just leaked the documents about the Free State farm, you know, or even smaller stuff like, you know, the house that, the flat that the designer got in Dubai, I mean, that's a scoop on its own. So, you know, there's just there were these thousands of things we could suddenly write, and it was completely overwhelming, and that's why we as media houses also started to cooperate, because it was just too much for everyone. So I do think, you know, that one leak by one individual or a group of individuals was a pivotal moment in South African investigative history. In our book, I actually say I think it's the biggest story after Vlakplaas, you know, when Jacques wrote that in the Vrye Weekblad in '89.
I think don't pin your hopes too much on December, you know. I think we're limiting ourselves when we think, you know, something new might come up in December. But this whole period that we've experienced with Gupta leaks and all the other leaks and all the other captures of President Jacob Zuma, they've actually hurt the ANC very much. They've really hit it very hard, in the sense of that people have started to wake up to the idea that actually most of the ANC people are just there to serve themselves and their families. So look beyond this December, perhaps look at 2019. I think it's not only, you know, these Gupta leaks that have just opened people's, you know, eyes, etc. There were many stories, you know, including Kulubuse and many other people. And as much as many South Africans are unemployed, they're not uneducated, you know. If you look at the stats, there's a lot of educated South Africans, they're just unemployed. And they can, you know, reason with what they're seeing is happening in their society. A lot of youths, you meet them and they engage you, and they're engaging, you know, in a positive way. They can see what's going on in South Africa. They know what is going on. So we're not totally lost in terms of, you know, yeah, we're speaking English and, you know, maybe it's too high up, we're theorizing too much. But don't take people, you know, for a fool. The actual majority of South African youth, they actually do think and they do participate in many things. So let's not look at December only, because even if, you know, Cyril wins or Nkosazana wins, it's still a long period before 2019. But the real power actually lies with the people in 2019. They are the only ones who can decide what happens to South Africa after that. If they want this to continue, because that's actually what happened when Jacob Zuma came in. Everybody thought, you know, here's a good man. And the next thing that happened, we had Guptas.
I think we have to be careful not to think that if Jacob Zuma goes, everything is going to change. You know, I remember when I wrote this book and I spoke to some very experienced SARS officials. Now, within the first year after Tom Mohlahlana took over, besides losing the top executive of SARS, more than 50 managers resigned. They're gone. The investigative units are gone. And I had a conversation with these people about how do you build up the capacity of SARS again. It's going to take years and years and years. The same goes for the Hawks. The same goes for crime intelligence. Even an institution like the SABC, for example. The NPA. Brilliant prosecutors have left. Brilliant policemen have left and they're still leaving. I heard about two resignations this week, which is quite worrying. People that are leaving the Hawks. I know for a fact that the Hawks officials or the Hawks officers investigating the Gupta leaks at the moment are quite junior. They might find an odd sort of like scapegoat here and there, but they're not going to charge the Guptas, I can assure you now. So I think we have to be careful. I mean, I think we've made a beginning, and I think the elective conference is very important, but not everything is going to change when Zuma goes because of the enormous damage he's done. We're not going to undo it in a short period of time.
Hi, I'm a NIM from Africa Check. Congratulations again, Susan and Adriaan, for the prize you've won last night. Adriaan, I saw you comment that investigative journalism is saving the country. Now, I'm at the verge of hyperventilating at this stage whenever I spend time reading the stories, listening about state capture. As you're saying, you're writing about it, nothing's happening. It feels to me like you're just having your finger in the dike and preventing it just from flooding us all. Where's that optimism coming from? How is investigative journalism saving our country? Because we all know what's going on and nothing is changing.
Look, of course, Anam, there's a lot to be worried about, but let me give you some practical examples. If it wasn't for the reporting that all of us have done on someone like Richard Ndluli, then Freedom Under Law probably wouldn't have had information to go to court to ultimately get him out of the police. The same with Nkobo Jiba at the NPA. Look at the nuclear transaction. You know, the nuclear transaction, since the earliest reports of those strange trips that Tina Jumat-Peterson made to, I think it was Austria, and she signed a piece of paper which she then denied signing. Rosatom said, we've won the deal, government denied it. Then we had Zuma's strange trip to Russia with David Mahlobo to get new blood from Putin. You know, those things were all in the media, and that ultimately led to a new grouping of civil society activists, the religious leaders in Cape Town, going to the Western Cape High Court, which has stopped the deal and which has set it back by conservatively a year. So, I mean, those things do give me hope. You know, I do think, you know, if it wasn't for the type of reporting that all of us have been doing, these civil society organizations wouldn't have had something to work on and go to court. Of course, it's desperately, you know, desperate. I mean, there should be proactive investigations by the Hawks and the NPA, but it's not happening, and we don't have the power to make it happen, and it's not frankly our role. Our role is to uncover these stories and put them in the public domain for prosperity and for history, so that nobody can ever say we didn't know.
Thank you. I'm an editor with OCCRP. I just wanted to mention that, you know, a difficult issue to talk about is that all journalists are not equal. AmaBhungane, Sam Soul, for example, had access to a lot of the state capture whistleblowers and chose to respect them because they were very vulnerable. So they passed up many, many scoops far in advance of Gupta leaks to make sure that these people were safe, whereas the Sunday Times, in an article called The Dark Heart of State Capture, exposed the whistleblower who's being sued, criminal and civil lawsuits, driven to bankruptcy, smeared. So we have to start differentiating between who we read as the truth and who we don't. And when the journalists that published misinformation will take responsibility for it, because the gutting of SARS, men like Ivan Pillay, was essentially a very strong move in favor of the Zuma and Gupta camp. So that needs to be unpacked, perhaps in a different forum, but it's a very critical part of where investigative journalism can save or work in the opposite and for the opposite motives.
Okay, I totally disagree with you when you say we exposed the identity or the whistleblower. We never did. In fact, I wrote the story.
I know, and that's why I'm bringing it up, because yes. I know her very well, and your story is the basis of the criminal lawsuit against her that's used by Trillian and the Guptas. Sorry to be controversial, but she is driven to bankruptcy because of your story.
No, I disagree with you. I actually have an excellent relationship with the lady you are talking about. I never exposed her. I did protect her, and it was bound to happen that they will go after her, whether I had written the story or not. But that document was going to come out. I never, at any point, compromised her identity, her location. I never. Which is why I still have a great relationship with her, which is why she's also now been able to go public and become a person who actually is a witness in the state capture inquiry. When you say I compromised it, I'm sorry, I disagree with you there, sister.
I have a question for Jacques. Can you please give us an update on the legal actions that have been taken against you since publishing your book? Of course, as an attempt to silence investigative journalism. Thanks.
Well, we're not sure. We're trying to find out. We know that the State Security Agency has instituted charges against me, according to the Intelligence Act. SARS wrote us a letter to say they're going to charge me for contravening the Tax Administration Act. They haven't charged me yet. We found out that on Monday morning, policemen from the Durban North Police Station in Durban try to get a warrant for my arrest from a Pietermaritzburg magistrate. The magistrate told them to go away to Voertzak, so I'm not sure what happened to that, and whether they're going to another magistrate. It was a warrant for arrest for the Tax Administration Act, criminal injuria, fraud. There were 5 charges. Anyway, so you know, they've been very quiet now for 10 days. It doesn't mean that they're not going to come again. I think Arthur Fraser is now sitting back and trying to devise another strategy. He, by the way, and it was a very interesting development, you know, and I won't go into detail, but with the fraud that they committed at State Security, they, amongst others, copied and pasted the minister's signature, who was Ronnie Casserol's at the time. And Arthur Fraser this week wrote a letter to Casserol's to say to him he urgently wants to see him to explain it to him. I haven't spoken to Ronnie yet, but I will. So there are all kinds of developments. We're not quite sure what they're up to. They're very, very quiet at the moment. It doesn't mean that they're not going to try something. Now, State Security said this week that they're still contemplating bringing an urgent application. I don't know where they get their legal advice from or where these attorneys got their legal degrees from. But if they still want to bring an urgent application to stop the book, it is completely and utter laughable. So I don't know what they do. I don't know what they're plotting. I don't know what they're strategizing, but we know that there are things happening.
Okay, let me go to the back. There are a couple of questions at the back that was neglected.
May I ask one question, please?
Yes, you're included in that.
Hi, I'm Sonia Sarkar. I work with the Telegraph newspaper back in India. You know, it's amazing to know about your work, because this is not the kind of journalism we are seeing in India currently. In India, media, a large section of media is becoming the propaganda machinery of the state. You know, the journalist will take selfies with the Prime Minister. Media giants would call the Prime Minister to give away journalism awards. Then if there is a anti-state report on page 1, there will be ruling party leaders writing edit page columns. So that's the kind of journalism that's happening. And there's a small section of media which is taking on the establishment on a daily basis. But there's a huge divide. You know, there's a nationalistic press and there's this anti-national press. I mean, thankfully I belong to the latter. But I would like to know, what sort of divide do you see in South Africa within the media fraternity? Is there such labeling happening here? Thank you.
Absolutely, and I think, you know, this is an interesting discussion to have, because we have, for a long time, let me just start by saying the politicians still refer to the media when they criticize us. And then I kind of interrogate them these days, because you have to ask them specifically, who are you referring to if you speak about the media? Because in my view, there's now more pro-government, government-friendly journalists in South Africa than critical journalists. If you look at the media houses, the SABC, thank goodness the SABC is busy turning around, and specifically due to the brave work of people like Thanduxolo, who's here. But I think there's still a lot of work to be done at the SABC. The independent group has been captured, in a different way. And we see a lot of mistaken and misleading reporting happening there. The Gupta family themselves started a media company called ANN7 on TV and the New Age newspaper, which is publishing propaganda for the Zuma faction, plain propaganda. The president of this country has never given an interview in the past 3 years to private media. He's given one last week to their TV station. Very friendly interview with still the Bell Pottinger rhetoric coming through. So we definitely in South Africa have a growing body of pro-friendly, government-friendly media that's of grave concern to me.
My name is Lekgeto from Lesotho. My first question is directed to Comrade Jika, because I think he understands the situation in my country, Lesotho. Working for Sunday Times as an independent paper, and when they were dealing with the Gupta leaks, they knew they were going to expose big companies like KPMG and Eskom. In my country, such big companies, they are a no-go area, because they sort of have captured the newspapers. They are the big advertisers, And because in my country, the corporate sector is very small, there are such companies which are a no-go area. You can't expose them. So I want to ask him, what advice would he give to my country in Lesotho facing such a situation whereby there are companies that you can't expose? My second question is directed to the rest of the panel. It's about following the Gupta leaks. You have been accused of this so-called the white monopoly capital. And I don't even know what that means, but I understand it's racist. How are you dealing with that? Thank you.
Okay, can I answer the second one first, and then I'll come back to that one. I mean, we've been referred to as regime change agents sponsored by white monopoly capital, which, I mean, it was an easiest thing to focus on, you know, in South Africa, because they know that South Africa is a country that's, you know, got this apartheid history of, you know, divided through race. So it's a very simple way of trying to deflect attention from the seriousness of what they're trying to do in stealing, you know. And then if you are black, then no, you are sponsored by the white monopoly capital. So I mean, that rhetoric actually is, for me, it's backward and actually dangerous. It's not only just stupid, but it's very dangerous. On the issue of, you know, how you guys you know, can survive, you know, when you're exposing these companies which actually have a monopoly in Lesotho. I know, I mean, you know, you've got companies that actually, you know, run everything in Lesotho. I think for you as journalists, you should look into, you know, partnering with, you know, South African media companies. Rather than publishing in Lesotho, publish in South Africa, because now, I mean, we live in a global, you know, global space. Then they can't blame your newspaper. You can blame AmaBhungane, you can blame News 24, you can blame Sunday Times and say, but you know, they're the ones who came here and did the story. I think that's the best way to survive it, because the situation in Lesotho, it's not going to change. It's a very small country, and if you write anything negative about a big company in Lesotho, they will close you down, because they're going to take advertising, and you won't have, you know, anywhere else to go. But my advice is just cross the border, man.
Hi, it's Michael from the Media Online Media Magazine. Question for Adriaan and Susan. Are you concerned that we're going to be seeing more government attempts to intervene in investigative journalism and to quash investigative journalism stories like what has happened to Jacques? And a quick comment from you about, are we going back to the era of censorship of journalism that we saw under the apartheid regime?
I mean, it's a difficult one. I think, in a way, it's very difficult for them to actually get that right when we are publishing online and that kind of thing. I mean, you know, to a degree, Jacques, because it's a book that kind of does maybe give them some hope that will be successful. I think the courts, though, have shown overwhelmingly that they will not interdict journalists. So I think we're in a good position from that perspective. Yeah, I'm not sure if you want to.
I think that, you know, the spooks are going after Jacques, let's be sure. I mean, I do think, and the rogue elements in SARS, the real rogues. You know, what worries me a lot, Michael, is the chilling effect that this is going to have on journalists, specifically our junior colleagues working in newsrooms, who see this happening to someone like Jacques, and who would then quickly decide to rather join the sports department or the motoring department, you know, because they are scared of the consequences this may have. And no respect to my colleagues who work in sport and motoring, especially the good ones. But I think that, you know, this is, so that, you know, for me, a junior news reporter sitting in a newsroom who sees this intimidation going on, you know, and this is not the first case, it won't be the last. And the intimidation is, of course, not only by the government and by state security, but also by attorneys representing private companies who send you these threatening letters, you know, threatening to sue you and your mother. And those things can be quite scary, you know. And luckily, in my own case, thankfully, I was working with experienced people like Sam Sol and Stefan Brummer, who could tell me, look, we know this is what's happening, you know, we kind of get used to it, grow a thick skin, etc. But I think for a young journalist, it can be quite overwhelming to receive that first lawyer's letter or that first death threat.
Yeah. Okay. My name is Tiamo. My question relates probably to what latter you've just said in terms of extensive work, because you're at a very, I mean, resourceful institutions, you know, but what about people that are in the general sense within community radio, community newspapers, where they're exposing nice stories within those particular institutions, but because they do not have the protection and that type of high profile that you guys are getting in huge media houses, how do they then sort of link up with or get that particular protection? The second question relates to, Adriaan, you spoke about sort of false stories or fake stories being put into newsrooms. And I want to contend that one of the issues that have been put into newsrooms that has not been investigated or demystified is white monopoly capital. Because the notion that relates to capital is that capital is there, it's corrupt, and it facilitates this entire process of state capture. And you guys have failed to demystify that particular notion. And suddenly you're surprised that KPMG, McKinsey, and all of these guys are involved within this because it is in the nature of that particular capital that there's things like lobbying, things like facilitating deals, things of that particular that allows and makes it facilitates a particular process of corruption and capture within that particular notion. And I want to know why is it that the notion is that you do not want to call it to say that capitalism, the way that it is inbred, that the way that it is within that particular notion, allows for all of this, and that there needs to be a systematic change in order that institutions are not captured. One thing that is there is that something like a people's budget, why can't people, you know, democratize budgeting? Why isn't it that particular notion that because if at all there is democratization of that process,
okay,
then we are maybe
should I start answering? Yes. Okay. I think the mere fact that we know KPMG has done this and, you know, McKinsey has done this, it's been through media. Nobody denies that capital in South Africa is white dominated. I don't think that has ever been in dispute, and it should be resolved by many ways. But in terms of the community newspapers and community radio, I mean, it's a very difficult space, you know, that one, you know, maneuvers in. I started my career in 2005-04 at a community newspaper, and I've always liked, you know, to write about government. I used to like writing about council, and in that community newspaper, it caused problems because, you know, there was this consistent threat by the municipality in Port Alfred that they will pull advertising, and luckily I had an editor that was, you know, very, you know, strong, and she didn't let them push them. So I don't know how, you know, how do you really how do you balance that? Because at the same time, you really do need, you know, advertising to pay for, you know, rates and everything. It's a very difficult space. I think it's for each and every paper or radio station to decide where do they want to go, do they, you know, which space do they want to maneuver. If you are in it to try and make money, by all means, you know, just remain, you know, in your lane. But if you want to, you know, change things and you do have financial backing somewhere else, yes, do that. I mean, there's a lot of financial backers that back community newspapers and radio stations. One needs to try those. We did not arrive at the Sunday Times. We did not arrive at City Press. We also started somewhere, and we started in those community newspapers. We started in those community radio stations. And we were determined that we are not going to allow our country, you know, go down the drain just because we think, you know, if I do this and then my career is going to end. I think we need a conversation around how one, you know, gets their community newspapers and radio stations funded.
You got to cut off. Okay. The only thing I would say, I'd love to answer all the questions, but I'd say in terms of community radio, reach out. There's a lot of organizations, there's a lot of lawyers who are willing to work pro bono. There is a lot of help, and I think when you can partner, then you can help to protect yourself and make those stories easier to publish.
There's a long answer, and I would like to chat to you afterwards a bit longer. For now, 30 seconds. When Victoria Gigan and Lord Bell traveled to South Africa to meet with Dudizane Zuma and the Guptas, I can promise you they did not have in mind uplifting the black people of this country. They had something else in mind.
All right, unfortunately, we've run out of time. Apologies that we've gone a little bit over. They are still around, so for those who still have pressing questions, please come to the front. Let's talk outside.